Welcome, everyone. I am Kristen Abbas, Director of Event Content for Vistage. I'm happy to host the latest webinar in our Peak Performer webinar series. This series is designed to support your leadership climb by bringing the most trusted experts in the Vistage community, experts who provide exceptional insights and best practices, helping you navigate new challenges and possibilities. World-class organizations have long recognized the powerful influence their cultures have on the performance of their people, and by extension, the performance of their companies. Not surprisingly, while most organizations allow their cultures to evolve naturally, top performing ones don't leave this to chance. Instead, they're amazingly intentional about how they create and drive the culture they want to have. This has an impact on employee retention as well as the ability to attract top talent in a competitive labor market. Today we've invited David Friedman, the 2021 Vistage Speaker of the Year, to share his insights on how to leverage your culture as a strategic competitive advantage. David, congratulations on your recent award. We appreciate the contribution you're making to our community and helping leaders have high-performing cultures. Welcome. Over to you.
It's my pleasure. It is great to be with everybody today. So good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. It's a pleasure to be with you. We are going to be talking about culture on this webinar, of course, but I'm going to share with you some things that are very practical about culture, because so often when we have conversations about culture, everybody talks about how important it is and how critical it is. And then you're left wondering, well, okay, that's nice. What do I do about it? And what I want to share with you, we'll talk a little bit about the importance, but I want to focus mostly on this webinar on practical things you can do in your business to use your culture as a strategic competitive advantage. So I want to begin with just a little brief background and just my personal story. I come from Southern New Jersey. For those that are wondering, that's where my Southern accent comes from. And I live in a small town in Southern New Jersey that's behind me. It's called Moorestown, New Jersey. It's just outside of Philadelphia. And I've lived in this town for most of my life, actually, since I was 13 years old. And I went to high school in Moorestown. I went to a school called Moorestown High School. And Moorestown High School has always been known, for as many years as I can remember, has always been known for one particular sport. Believe it or not, it is the sport of women's lacrosse. Lacrosse is very big, for those that may not know this, in the mid-Atlantic states, more so than it is in some other parts of the country. And the women's lacrosse team in my town of Moorestown, every year they're ranked in like the top 5 or 10 in the whole country. They're an incredible team. They went through one stretch where in an 18-year period, they won 17 state championships, believe it or not. They went through a stretch where they went 228 games without ever losing to a New Jersey team. I mean, this is just total domination. And the reason I tell you this is that I find public high school sports dynasties to be just a fascinating group of teams to study. And they're interesting to me because they have two dynamics that make them kind of unusual. The first is that in a public high school, for the most part, you can't recruit. You're just stuck with whoever happens to live in your town. You know, private schools are different, universities are different. I always say Texas is different. Those in Texas will know this. But everywhere else, we're stuck with whoever happens to live in our town. So think about that in the context of your organization, your company. Imagine if anybody who knocked on your door and said, okay, I'd like to work for you, you had to take them. Now, of course, right now, so many of us are desperate enough, we'd probably do that, but how hard would it be to build a really amazing organization if you had no choice but to take everybody who wanted to be there? That's what public high schools do. Secondly, in a school environment, think about this, you're turning over your roster every year. I mean, at least every couple of years as kids are graduating. So think about that again in the context of your organization. Imagine if anybody who knocked on your door and said, I want to work for you, you had to take them, and you turned over most of your team every year or two. How hard would that be to build a great organization? And yet that's what public high school sports dynasties do. So if you think about them, you think, well, then there's something going on there. And I don't think it's the water. There's something happening. And I think what's happened is these teams have built cultures. They've built levels of expectation. I'll tell you, if you're a woman in Moorestown, New Jersey, and you join that lacrosse team, you immediately pick up a vibe or an expectation that, you know what? We play like champions here. And it causes people to elevate their game beyond what they might somewhere else. In fact, I'm convinced that if my family moved from Moorestown, New Jersey to anywhere else in the country, and my daughter goes to the local high school and she joins a lacrosse team, if there is one, I don't think she's playing at the same level anymore. Now, she didn't lose all her skills, it's still her, but she's on a different team with a different set of expectations, and those expectations affect everything. And most of you know this, you don't have to have a PhD to know this, that any of you who are watching this webinar, just think about if you've been on some high-level program at any point in your life. It could have been a sports team, maybe it was a band, an orchestra, a debate team, whatever. Imagine when you were on that team, there was a legacy, there was almost a positive kind of pressure that you knew that you got to bring your A game because this is a championship kind of program. And it causes people to elevate their game. And I think the same thing happens in our companies, that if you think about your employees, my experience is that you could take your employees and, like anything, you could plot them on a very typical bell curve. That on one end of the spectrum, you're going to have typically, I'm going to say 5 or 10% of your people who I call these people rock stars. You could put these people in any environment and they're going to stand out because that's just how they are. And on the other end of the spectrum, you're going to have 5, 10% of your people who candidly, they're going to stink up the joint no matter where you put them. You could put these people in the best possible environment and they're not going to be very good. But in between, you've got about 80% of your people who will go with the flow. You put those people in a high-performing championship kind of environment, and they're going to raise their level to match what they see going on around them. And you put those exact same 80% of people in a low-performing environment, and they're going to sink to the level of the people around them because the environment has that much influence. And when we understand that, what that suggests to me is, as leaders in our companies, if we had some way that we could more purposely, more systematically create that kind of a championship environment in our company, well, that would seem like a pretty smart thing to do. And yet what's so fascinating is how few companies do. Most of us just kind of live with the culture that happens to us instead of purposely creating the culture that we want. And what I want to show you is, if you understand that, how do you do that? How do you actually go about doing it? Now, before I go there, I want to just share one other thought here for you. And that is that my observation is that every organization that comes together, every group of people that comes together has a culture. I guarantee if I asked you, if any of you that are on this webinar, if I asked you, do you have a culture or do you not? Everybody's got one. Whether it's what you want them to be or not's a different question, but you can't not have one. You put humans together, there's going to be a culture. Even a group of friends of yours has a culture. Think about a group of men or women that you play golf with, or you're in a church group, or you go fishing with, or whatever. There's a culture in the group. Your Vistage group has a culture. Every Vistage, I've spoken to hundreds of Vistage groups. Every one of them has a culture. When you think about where that comes from, here's what my observation is. In every group of people that comes together, there tend to be leaders who emerge. They're the ringleader. It's just the sheer nature of their personality. Those that have done DISC, predictive index, or anything else, they're the ones that are the more dominant personalities. They're the ones that the group of friends is getting together and we're trying to decide where to meet for dinner. And inevitably somebody raises their hand and says, "Tom, how about we go to Abby's Bar and Grill at 6:30? Well, who said Abby's Bar and Grill at 6:30? It was the leader. And these leaders have a disproportionate amount of influence over the norms that get established for the group. And the reason that I point this out is that I would tell you that absent an intentional force on your part, in other words, if you're not purposely doing something about it, the exact same thing goes on in your company. That the culture of your organization ends up mostly being driven by those people who just happen to have the strongest personalities. And those people, by the way, aren't necessarily the designated managers, supervisors, and leaders. They're just the people with the strong personalities. And if those people happen to be positive, enthusiastic, hardworking, quality-oriented kind of people, this will be great. Everything will work out fine. But what if they're not? What if some of those strong personalities in your organization happen to be cynical jerks with lousy attitudes? And we've all had jerks in our companies. Those jerks are going to influence the people around them to be more like them. And the reason I point this out, of course, is if we understand the impact that our culture has on every aspect of performance, not just your ability to attract and retain the people you want, but how they deliver service to your customers, the pride they take in the quality of the work that they're doing, how collaborative they are, how innovative. It's all affected by our culture. If we understand that, is that something we're just going to leave to the whims of whoever coincidentally happen to have the strongest personalities and hope it's going to work out okay? I wouldn't want to do that. As a leader, I'd want to grab this thing by the throat and make my culture be what I want it to be. And that's what I want to show you how to do in this webinar. So the way we're going to do that is I want to introduce you to a framework, a roadmap, a series of steps that in my experience it takes in order to systematically create and build and drive the culture you want into every part of your organization, whether your people are white collar or blue collar, whether they're working remotely, hybrid, or they're in person. How do you get the culture you want embedded into every part of the organization? And I call this framework the 8-step framework. 8 different things that when we do these 8 things, this is how you pull it off. And while all of these 8 steps are important, and I'm going to talk about each of them a little bit, my experience also shows me that ultimately there are 2 of these 8 steps, in fact, the 2 in the middle of this diagram, that have a disproportionate amount of influence over your success. In other words, if we do these 2 things well, you're going to be 80 or 90% of the way down the road to success. And if we don't do these 2 things well, you're not really going to get very far. So in the interest of the time that we have together on this webinar, I want to do a brief overview of all 8 steps, and then I want to go back and just do a little bit deeper dive on these 2 steps in the middle. So the first of our 8 steps is, it has to be our starting point. It's the most important of the steps. It's the most obvious of the steps too. And that is that we've got to be able to define with enough clarity exactly what we want our culture to be. Now, the reason that I say that this is so critical and yet so obvious is, how could we possibly go about building a specific culture if you can't tell me, well, what is it we're trying to build in the first place? And as obvious as that sounds, my experience is very few companies do this well. I bet almost everybody on this webinar has some written vision, mission, values. And yet I would tell you, and I don't mean to insult anybody, but most of the time, in my experience, it's usually pretty fluffy, it's pretty nebulous, and it really doesn't bring the level of clarity that we need. I say that driving a culture more than anything is actually a teaching function. It's not about signs on your website with your vision, mission, values. It's what are you and the other leaders in your organization teaching your people day after day after day. And if you don't know what you're teaching them because you've not defined it clearly enough, you're not going to do it very effectively or consistently. So one of the first things that I want to show you how to do here is I want to show you a new and a different way to define exactly what you want your culture to be and how to build a whole curriculum around it so that everybody's teaching the same thing. And I'm going to show you how to do that. Now, the second step in the overall framework is the other of the big ones, and I call it creating rituals. Creating rituals is all about how we make things last. Because we all have the experience in our organizations rolling out new programs and new initiatives, and this is going to be great. And then we get really busy and we get a big customer, lose a key employee, and it all kind of falls by the wayside and becomes another flavor of the month. And I know this is particularly true in Vistage. You guys, you hear so many good ideas in a Vistage meeting, and then you go back to work and you get busy and life gets in the way and it falls by the wayside. Well, rituals are the key to making things last. This is one of the simplest things I've ever learned in my life. And at the same time, I will tell you it's one of the most powerful things I've ever learned. And I'm going to come back and do a little deeper dive on this concept. And when I show this to you, you're probably going to say, that is the most obvious thing I've ever thought about, except you haven't been thinking about it. And so I'm going to make that really clear for you because it's a game changer in making this a sustainable effort. All right, the third step in our overall framework is something I know everybody on this webinar is struggling with right now, and that is that we've got to be able to select people who are going to be a good fit for our culture. And when I say a good fit, I mean people that are going to be the way we want them to be. And I say that I say to people all the time, if I look at the people that you interview and the people that assuming they actually show up for their interview, when they show up for that interview, they're already, I like to call them fully baked. I don't mean that in a Colorado kind of way, by the way. When I say they're already fully baked, I'm talking about people who are already, their value system, how they look at the world, is mostly already done by the time they show up to you. And the reason I say this is you're not going to have a lot of luck taking people who aren't a good fit in your culture and expecting to do some kind of an intervention to convert them into becoming a good fit. I mean, it rarely works. I'll bet most of you on this webinar have had some experience with hiring. How many of you have done this? I did this early in my career. Did you ever hire somebody who you thought would be awesome if they could just be different? I did that. I remember when I was earlier in my career and I was younger and I was more naive. I was a new leader and I thought I was so good, I could coach people out of all their issues. And I learned early, it rarely works. We got to start with people who are already going to be a good fit because we're not changing the ones that aren't. Now, by the way, that is easier said than done. And I'll tell you right up front, we are never going to bat 1,000 in recruiting. We're not. We're going to make mistakes. But I'll tell you, there's a big difference between the mistake that we make being, I interviewed this woman and I thought she was perfect. I mean, she looked like she had everything we needed. But it turns out I misjudged it. I didn't read the signs right. I didn't pick up on something I should have seen. That's going to happen sometimes. That, however, is a distinctly different mistake from the mistake being, I knew she wasn't a good fit and we hired her anyway. That's the mistake we've got to avoid. And we've all done it. Everybody on this webinar has done it. Right now, we probably do it more than ever. And the single biggest reason we do that is desperation. Every Vistage group I speak to, every one of the companies is struggling to find people. We're all understaffed right now. And we meet somebody and how long are we going to keep looking? We got customers to serve and projects to get done. And it's just so tempting to bring in this person because we need a body. And then we bring in somebody who's not a good fit and it destroys our company. Sometimes I say it this way. Sometimes it feels like we're comparing this candidate to an empty chair. Compared to an empty chair, she looked awesome. But is she really what we needed? Probably not. It takes an extraordinary amount of discipline on all of our parts to avoid that. Again, it's nice to say in the theoretical world that you shouldn't do that. But I get it. We're all running our companies in the real world, and we are short-staffed, and we are under a lot of pressure. And yet I will tell you, we are never going to build the kind of company we want, bringing in people who aren't a good fit. It takes a lot of discipline. All right, the fourth step in our overall framework is something that I call integration. Integration is the word that I use for what some of you call orientation, or some use the new agey term that I hate, onboarding. I hate that word. It always sounds like waterboarding to me. But at some companies, it's similar, by the way. But whatever words you want to use, it's the word that describes how do you take the people we just hired and how do you bring them into the organization? The reason I use this word integration is I think it has a different connotation. Like orientation suggests I'm telling you about us, I'm orienting you to us, where integration is a word of assimilation. I'm bringing you into the fold, I'm making you a part of who we are. But whatever words you want to use, I don't really care. The point is, how you do that has a huge influence over your culture, huge. I say to people all the time, if I went to work for any of your companies, I would tell you that the first several days to a week are just about the most important days in my entire career. Yeah, that's true. That this is where they're figuring out what's the deal around here. These are their first impressions, and first impressions tend to be lasting. There's an analogy I use often. People have heard me use this for the power of integration. I think of it this way. I come into your organization on the first day, and I'm going to put a pair of eyeglasses on. And imagine that those eyeglasses have a prescription lens in them. And based upon the prescription that's in the lens, I'm going to see things differently. I could look at your organization and it looks very different to me if I'm wearing one prescription versus another, because the prescription is filtering or influencing my vision. So I'm going to come in, I'm going to put this pair of eyeglasses on. You have an opportunity from the very beginning to write the prescription for my glasses, to influence how I see, perceive, interpret, experience everything that happens after this. It's like, I think of it almost like brainwashing in a positive kind of way. You get to brainwash me to see the world through the lens that you want me to see it. And if you don't take advantage of that opportunity at the beginning, it's like allowing me to come in on that first day and there's this big pile of eyeglasses on the ground, and I close my eyes and I randomly pick one up and put them on, and who the heck knows what the prescription is? Or worse, what if one of those cynical jerks I mentioned before with the lousy attitudes, what if a jerk grabs me on the first day, says, David, come on, put my glasses on. Let me tell you how things really work around here. You think that's going to have any influence? Darn right. And good luck changing it later. It's not like 6 months later you could say, you know, I know we got off to a bad start. Could we just hit the reset button and do it over? No. We have one chance to do this well. And it's remarkable how few companies do. To take the time and effort to orchestrate every aspect of a new person's experience in your organization. Huge impact. All right, fifth step in our overall framework. I call it communicating your culture and making it visible. And when I talk about communicating, I'm talking about all of the different ways that people physically, literally see your culture. And this ranges from signs on the walls to things that might be on an electronic display board in the reception area to screensavers, mouse pads, painted on your trucks. The more I see stuff about your culture everywhere, the more likely I'm thinking about it. And I want to be crystal clear here. I'm not suggesting that if we put some beautiful signs up with our vision, mission, and values, that we're going to somehow magically transform our culture. Obviously, it's not that simple. But I'll tell you, if the only time I ever see a physical written form of your culture is on the new, on the first day in the new hire paperwork, sandwiched between the benefit enrollment forms and the I-9 is an 8.5 by 11 with your vision, mission, and values. And that's the last time I've ever seen anything that has to do with your culture. How likely am I thinking about it? How likely are we talking about it? How likely is it seeping into my consciousness? But if everywhere I look, I'm inundated with things about our culture, we're more likely talking about it. We're more likely thinking about it. I'm absorbing it. I think of it really, by the way, just like internal advertising. The more this is around me, the more I'm thinking about it. And again, this isn't a replacement for other things we need to do. It's just a really simple and yet important element of additional reinforcement to everything else we're doing. All right, the sixth step in our overall framework, I call it coaching. When I talk about coaching, what I'm referring to is how you use the day-to-day situations that come up in your organization to teach and reinforce your culture. In other words, you're going to hear me say this a lot. To me, your culture isn't necessarily the signs on the walls. It's what your people are doing every day. And every day, you and the other leaders in your company have opportunities to give people coaching and feedback. A customer issue comes up, a vendor issue, an issue between two employees, and you're giving them coaching about what you want them to do. Well, every time in that coaching session, every time you use the specific language and vocabulary of your culture in that coaching, you're pulling it off the wall and you're making the stuff real and relevant and meaningful. Again, using that language has such a powerful impact in helping connect the dots for people so they realize that stuff you told them on the first day or that stuff that's on the website, that's not just signage, that's how we do things here. Simple thing. All right, seventh step in our overall framework is something everyone on this webinar already knows, and yet we need to touch on it. And that is your own leadership example. You know this. Your people are watching all of us. They're watching you as leaders, and they're taking their cue from you about what really matters here. We could talk all day long about the values and the mission and the vision and all that stuff. And at the end of the day, none of it matters except what do you actually do? Because they're observing you and they're learning from everything that you do. I sometimes say that as leaders, everyone on this webinar, one of our most important roles, it might even be our most important, is that every one of us is a teacher. That's really what we are. We're teachers. And it doesn't matter, by the way, whether you want that job or not. You're stuck with it simply by virtue of being a leader. Because your people are watching you every day and they're learning from every single thing that you do. They're even learning from the things you don't do. I mean, you say it's important to show up on time and you're late. I guess it's not important to show up on time. You say that safety is important in your organization and you see somebody on your team not wearing their hard hat on a job site and you don't address it. I guess safety is not important. Everything you do and don't do is teaching them. So when you really think about this, I think one of the implications of this is you start to really raise your level of intentionality about everything that you do. You're about to do or say something. And I sometimes say it this way, it's almost like you've got a megaphone and everything you do is being amplified in its impact simply because of your role. In other words, somebody else in your company could say or do the same thing, and it doesn't have the same impact. But simply because of your role, it has amplified or magnified impact. So when you get that, you're about to do or say something, you think, okay, I'm casting a message to the organization right now about what we stand for. Let me be really thoughtful about what I'm doing because I am sending a message. All right, the eighth and last step in the overall framework, I call it creating accountability for our culture. And when I talk about accountability here, I don't mean general accountability, but rather more specifically, accountability for our culture. In other words, how are we showing ourselves, our people, the world that we're not kidding? We're actually serious about this. Because if there's no accountability for it, it's just a wish. It's a hope. There's got to be some teeth behind this. Many different ways we can do that. For example, I'll bet probably at least half of you on this webinar include some elements of your culture in your performance review system, as you should. If I was in your company and I'm sitting with my manager going through a performance review, whatever that looks like in your company, and nowhere in the conversation is there any discussion at all about our culture, what conclusion do you think I'd come to? It's probably not that important. I mean, it's not the only thing there, but it ought to be there somewhere if it was important to us. Of course, it would be difficult to do that in any substantive way if I didn't have enough clarity about what my culture was supposed to be in the first place. Here's another example of accountability. This is something I do in my company and many of our clients. So my company's culture is defined in terms of a very specific set of behaviors that we teach. And I'll share that with you shortly. One of those behaviors is one I'm really passionate about. I'm passionate about all of them, but one I'm really passionate about, I call it honor commitments. Do what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it. It's a big deal to me. So that's one of our behaviors. So what we do on this survey is we take each of the behaviors that drive our culture and we write a description of what would you see if we were doing this well. And so honor commitments would say, our employees do what they say they're going to do when they say they're going to do it. So we write a description like that for each of our behaviors. Then every year we survey all of our customers, all of our vendors and suppliers, and all of our own employees. And we ask them on each of these specific behaviors that define our culture. Do we almost always, usually, sometimes, seldom, or never do this? So now we're being really transparent. Is this a bunch of BS, or do we actually do these things? If you're into continuous improvement like we are, because by the way, we can also take that almost always, usually, sometimes, seldom, or never, and convert that to a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 scale. And now we actually have a metric, a number for how well we live to the things we talk about. If you're into continuous improvement like I am, and I know many of you are, you could look at what your score is this year and resurvey next year and ask, have we improved the degree of consistency between what we claim our culture is and what actually shows up in real life every day? Now we're getting pretty serious. So there's a lot of different things we can do to drive accountability, but this is something I talk about in every Vistage talk. The biggest thing you can do to demonstrate seriousness or accountability for your culture is literally to get rid of somebody who's not a good fit. That virtually every organization I've ever seen has at least one person who desperately needs to be fired. They're a pain in the butt. They're opposite of everything we claim is important. We talk about them in our management meeting over and over. We bring them up to our Vistage group over and over. Every chair tells me it's the first new issue that every new member brings to a Vistage group. The person that everybody knows they need to fire and they're still reluctant to do it. My anecdotal study of this is about 80% of these people tend to be salespeople. And what they all have in common is that they're a pain in the butt. They're opposite of everything that we say is important, but we're worried about our ability to replace them. If it's the classic salesperson, he or she's a pain in the neck, but boy, they bring in a lot of business, or they've got some of our most important customer relationships. And when we fail to address these people and address the situation, we're basically sending a loud, clear message to the whole organization. We're telling everybody, folks, I want you to understand our culture is really important here. Unless you produce enough business. You know, I sometimes say it this way, this is kind of blunt, but the best way for me to really know your culture is to look at the behavior that you tolerate. I don't care about the stuff you put on the website or the stuff you told me when you hired me. What you allow to go on around here, that's the real culture. You know, in Vistage groups, I always ask the leaders, how many of you have ever fired one of those people? And everybody raises their hand and I ask them, so what did everybody say when you did fire that person? And practically in unison, they say to me, Thank God. We were wondering when you were going to do this. And then I asked the leaders, so what did you say to yourself after you fired that person? And practically in unison, they say to me, what took me so long? I should have done this a long time ago. You know, it's the clearest message we'll ever send that we're not kidding. And I want to be crystal clear, by the way, I'm a big advocate for coaching and mentoring. I am not suggesting that at the earliest sign of trouble, we're clearing people out. Nor do I want anybody to watch this webinar and go back and fire somebody willy-nilly. I'm done that. People we've been coaching and mentoring forever. And at some point, you don't get to be on the team anymore. It's the clearest we'll ever be. So this is the framework we're going to use to think about how we could be way more systematic in our approach to building the culture that we want. Now that we've got this big picture, I want to go back to these two things that were in the middle and do a deeper dive on those. So when we talk about how do we define with way more clarity exactly what we want that culture to be, I want to draw for you a very important language distinction. This is one of the most important things I could tell you. And it's a distinction I didn't used to think about, yet it's really important. And it's a distinction between what I call values and what I call behaviors, because I think they're different from each other. And the difference is more than just semantics. So let me explain to you what that difference is and why this is so important. So a value to me is typically an abstract concept. Examples of values are things like you see here: integrity, quality, respect, innovation, teamwork, service, collaboration. These are ideas, they're notions, concepts. A behavior, in contrast, is an action. It's something I can literally see people doing. Some of the behaviors I teach in my own company are things like honor commitments. That's something you do. Practice blameless problem solving. Be a fanatic about response time. Get clear on expectations. These are actions that people do. So a value is typically an abstract idea where behavior is an action. In parts of speech, I sometimes think of it like, picture a value is a noun and a behavior is a verb. It's a thing versus an action, okay? Now, why does this matter? Who cares? Well, here's why this is relevant and not just a question of semantics. The problem, in my experience, with most organizations, not all, but most organizations, traditional looking set of core values is that they tend to be so abstract that they mean too many different things to different people. And they become, therefore, very difficult to operationalize in any meaningful kind of way. Let me give you a really simple example. One of the values that I see in many organizations on their list of core values is they'll have the value for respect. We should all respect each other. And shoot, who could argue with that? I mean, especially these days, that's pretty important. And yet, what does that word mean? It means a lot of different things to different people. If you grew up in an inner city gang, your definition of what it looks like to respect somebody, or maybe to diss them, could be completely different than what it might mean in your family. Or I think about regional differences. Those of you that are on this webinar and you're in the southern part of the US, in the Bible Belt, many of you were raised, I'm sure, as children, that even the Midwest too, that you were raised as children that when you speak to an adult, you call them sir or ma'am. It's disrespectful not to do that. Tell you what, do that in the Northeast where I live, that's just freaking weird. Has nothing to do with respect at all, just different norms. I have a college friend of mine who's a school superintendent of a large public school district in Ohio. I was with him a couple of years ago, and he was telling me he was very frustrated that the teachers in his school district were angry with him because they felt disrespected because they didn't get a large enough pay increase. He looks at this and says, that's a budget issue. That has nothing to do with respect. To them, it's a respect issue. We all have different ideas of what this word means. So to simply say, well, we value respect, okay, I just don't know that's all that helpful. Behaviors, because they're so much more action-oriented, are much easier to teach and coach and guide and give people feedback about. It is extraordinarily difficult to coach somebody about their values, but I could coach them all day long about what I see them doing or not doing. Give you just an example of just one of the behaviors in my own company. And by the way, I give behaviors a name. So you'll hear this and stuff in my books and my material. I call them fundamentals because they're fundamental to success. So it's just a name I give to a behavior. So one of the fundamentals in my own company is called practice blameless problem solving. And so the way this shows up is there's a title to the fundamental, the behavior, the fundamental, and then there's a description. So this description says, what does it mean to practice blameless problem solving? It says, apply your creativity, spirit, and enthusiasm to developing solutions rather than just pointing fingers or dwelling on the problem. Identify the lessons learned and use those lessons to improve our processes so we don't make the same mistake again. Get smarter with every mistake and learn from every experience. Now, that's a robust behavior. If we were teaching that, that's a lot easier to teach than quality, integrity, loyalty. So defining these in terms of real behaviors makes it way easier to teach. Now, I want to share one other thought about this before I move on from this idea of behaviors, because many organizations that I've seen have started to kind of wake up about this behavior thing. And what they'll do is they'll take their values, and for each of their values, they'll try to break it down into behaviors. And that sounds like a good idea, but I want to show you one simple thought for why you might not want to do that. So what we sometimes do is you'll see a company and they'll have 4 values. I'm going to just make this up as an example: integrity, quality, excellence, and service. And then they'll try to identify, well, what are the behaviors that help us live to integrity? And what are the behaviors that help us live to quality, and so on? And so they'll define their behaviors, which sounds great, and it is. But here's the problem with that. There tend to be behaviors that might be really important that don't necessarily fit inside one of those boxes. And we would never think about them if we started with our core values and we narrowed our thinking and said the only behaviors we're going to think about are the ones that tie directly to these core values. So what I suggest people do instead is to actually start with the behaviors. Just allow yourselves the intellectual freedom to think about what are the behaviors that are really important in this company, and how do I articulate those so we can start teaching them to people. So I suggest that we define our culture not in terms of that typical broad nebulous set of values, but rather in terms of the behaviors that you say, if we could get our people to just do these things more consistently, we're going to be incredibly successful. Now, once we've got that set of behaviors, the second step in that framework is what I said, I call it creating rituals. So let me explain to you what a ritual is and why this is so important and how to use it. So a ritual is some routine, some behavior that you do over and over and over again until it becomes baked in. It just becomes second nature. So examples of rituals, every time you go to a professional sporting event or even a collegiate one, what do? We sing the national anthem. Some people before a meal, they say a prayer. When I was a kid in school, we used to say the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. You wake up in the morning and hopefully you brush your teeth every morning. It's just a routine. It's just what we do. The reason that this concept is so important is that once something becomes a ritual, it's no longer difficult to do. Most humans, just the nature of being human, we are not very good. In fact, we stink at sticking with things. We start the diet and exercise program that doesn't last. We roll out the program at work that we're all excited about that doesn't last because we're just not that good at it. Once it becomes a ritual, it's no longer difficult to do. It's just what we do. Most of us don't struggle to remember to brush our teeth in the morning. You get up, you go through a series of activities. It's just what you do. So here's the concept I want you to consider. If there was a way that we could create rituals that were as automatic as brushing our teeth or the national anthem or a prayer before a meal, if we could create rituals that were that automatic around how we teach and practice those behaviors, or fundamentals as I call them, now we've got something that could last for years and years and years into the future, because its continuity, its sustainability would no longer be dependent upon your discipline and motivation. See, it's not you that's going to keep it going, it's the ritual that's going to keep it going. So what does that look like in practice? Well, the way we do this is we take those behaviors, those fundamentals as I call them, and we roll them out in highly interactive, engaged work sessions with all the employees. And then we begin to focus on one fundamental each week. So week number 1, everybody in the organization, in every department, every location, remote, in person, doesn't matter, all week long, we're thinking about, working on, focusing on practicing fundamental number 1 through a series of rituals. And I'll give you an example in just a moment. The week after that, everybody in the company everywhere is focused on fundamental number 2. And the week after that, 3 and 4 and 5 and so on. When we get to the end of the list, we go back to the beginning and we do it over and over and over and over and over again forever. because that's how it sinks in. So let me give you just one example to help you see what I mean by this. So in our company, and pretty much every one of our clients, every meeting we have, whether it's a Zoom meeting or an in-person meeting, whether it's a leadership meeting or a customer meeting, when we have a meeting in our company this week, the first agenda item of every meeting is the fundamental of the week. And we spend the first 3 or 4 minutes talking about it. What does it mean? How do we practice it? What could we do better? Did it just come up with a customer yesterday? We don't want to take over the meeting, just a few minutes, then we move on. But every single meeting this week, the first thing we do is we talk about the fundamental of the week. So think about your company and think about all the meetings that may be taking place this week or took place, since today's a Friday, all the meetings that took place throughout your company all throughout the week. And now imagine that in every one of those meetings, every one of your employees was talking about the exact same principle. That would be a lot of teaching that was going on. If we did that every week, think about the impact of that in the organization. So the concept here is, if we can create a number of different rituals, not just this one, but if we can create several different rituals that give us lots of chances to focus on and practice this week's fundamental, and we do the same thing next week with next week's fundamental and the following week with that one, and we cycle through them over and over and over and over again, sooner or later, they're going to become internalized in our people. So let me just sort of summarize this whole concept, and I'll wrap this up in a few minutes and open this up for questions. But to summarize this concept, the way I think of it is this, to kind of distill it. If you want to get good at anything you want to get good at, whether it's you want to become a concert pianist, or you want to learn to speak another language fluently, or you want to be a master cabinet maker, anything you want to get good at, the only way we get good at it is through lots and lots and lots and lots of practice. Malcolm Gladwell talks about the 10,000 hours it takes of focused practice and repetition. Whatever the number is, who knows, but it's a lot. Well, here's the problem. If we all understand the only way we're going to master something is through lots of repetition, most humans hate repetition. Well, what's the key to then to being able to sustain repetition? It's creating rituals. When something becomes a ritual, and by the way, I use that word almost interchangeably with the word habit. There's a couple of big bestsellers. Many of you have probably read The Atomic Habits, The Power of Habit. It's the exact same concept. Once something becomes a habit, a routine, a ritual, it's not hard to do anymore. So the ritual is the key to keeping it going, and that repetition is the key to mastering something. So let's apply this thought very, very directly to your company's culture. If driving a culture, embedding the culture that you want in your company, ultimately is nothing fancier or more complicated than getting your people to live and internalize the behaviors that drive success in your company. That's really all it is. Culture is not having parties on Fridays and bringing in pizza. Culture is getting your people to live and internalize and embed the behaviors that drive success. Well, they're not going to internalize those behaviors simply because you held a big company meeting one day and you announced it to everybody. Doesn't mean you shouldn't, but that's not going to be enough. They're not going to internalize those behaviors because you put posters all over the walls, though I still think it's a good idea. They're not going to internalize those behaviors because you put it in their performance reviews, though I still think you should. The only way they're going to internalize it is when you teach it to them over and 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 over again. And the only way you'll ever do it with that much consistency without getting bored, distracting, and quitting is when you create rituals. That's why rituals are so foundational to success. So I'm going to wrap this up with a quote that is my favorite quote on the topic of culture. And the quote says that good companies have good cultures by chance, but world-class companies have world-class cultures by design. And what I mean by that quote is when I say that good companies have good cultures by chance, I'm willing to bet that nearly everybody on this webinar is already a good leader. And if you're a good leader, you're going to do most of the right stuff naturally. You're going to hire good people. You're going to treat them well, not because you went to a Vistage meeting and somebody said you should treat your people well, or you didn't read a book that said that. What else are you going to do? You're a good person. And if you do that, you're going to be fine. You're not going to fail. I mean, I often say that what I teach people, at least, is not the difference between succeeding and failing. I mean, how could I claim it is? Many of you have been very successful without doing what I teach, so that can't be the difference. This isn't the difference between succeeding and failing. This is the difference between being successful and being extraordinary, because that's an entirely different game. That while good companies have good cultures by chance, the best companies in the world understand just how important their culture is to success, and they don't leave any of it to chance. Instead, they're incredibly intentional, purposeful, systematic about every aspect of how they build and drive the culture they want. None of it's left to chance. And what I'm suggesting is if you want to take that on, this is one framework you can use to think about how you could be a lot more systematic in your approach. And while all of these 8 steps that I've touched on briefly here are important, the reason I draw this the way that I do is I often say the 6 around the outer rim, I like to call those incremental, meaning we could look at how we're doing at selecting the best people to fit our culture, and we could make incremental improvements to get better. And we could look at our integration program in whatever form it may exist today, and we could make incremental improvements to get better and so on. But the 2 things that we focused on in the middle, I don't think those are incremental. If you don't define with enough clarity exactly what you want your culture to be, you're not going to get very far. Secondly, once you've got that clarity, the only way our people are going to internalize it is when we teach it to them over and over and over and over and over and over again. And the only way we're ever going to do that without getting bored, distracted, and quitting is when we create rituals around it. That's why I do this drawing the way that I do. So I'll leave it at that and open it up for questions. We've got 10 minutes or so that we can answer further questions. Christian, do you want to share some of the questions that have come up?
Yes, absolutely. Just waiting to be added to your screen. Let's see. And I'm going to add you. There we go.
There it is.
All right. So we had a couple of questions actually come in when we were doing registration. And I think one of the things that's top of mind for so many people in the new system of employment that we see ourselves in right now is how do we keep culture intact? How do we ritualize? How do we do all this while working in hybrid work environments or with remote teams?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one I hear in every Vistage group, and certainly it's top of mind for people. So let me make sort of a few general comments and a few specific things. So in general, what this hybrid and remote work environment has forced us to do is to need to be way more intentional or systematic than we ever used to be. And I see this dynamic that I'm going to describe this dynamic that I've observed as companies grow that happened before the pandemic, and the pandemic has just accentuated this challenge. So when companies are small, 5, 10 people, we as leaders, to an extent, could get away with not being so intentional. I'm the leader, I see everybody, they see me, I set a good example, and they pick up the vibe. And that's good enough. I mean, it'd be better if we were more systematic, but we could get away with not being more systematic. But as a company grows from 5 or 10 people to 20 or 40 or 50 or 100, or maybe has multiple locations, or maybe makes an acquisition or 2, all of a sudden, all those people aren't seeing me as the leader anymore. We can't rely on just my physical presence and example to carry the culture. We have to start being more systematic about this. Well, the pandemic actually forced that on everybody, regardless of your size. So it's true, certainly, if you're big, but even if you're small, if your people are working remotely, they're not seeing you. We can't rely on them just being around the water cooler or the coffee machine and, shooting the, what with each other and sort of pick up the vibe or the expectations by that. We have to have a systematic method. So the first thing I would say is we've got to be way more intentional, way more systematic than we've ever done. The system that I was describing, however briefly on this webinar, is just as effective whether people are working remotely or not. My current company is completely remote, and we've been that way since before the pandemic. And every week we practice our fundamentals. Every meeting we talk about, every Zoom meeting, we're talking about our fundamental of the week. There's a mobile app that we use that is how we drive a lot of that. And on the mobile app, and here's a picture of the mobile app, our people every week get a message from somebody on the team talking about this week's fundamental, and people engage with each other. Every week, every day, people get what we call a quick tip, which is right on their phone, they get a reminder of some aspect of their fundamental. And there's so many other things that we do. So my point is, we have to be more systematic because of people working remotely and hybrid. We have to be way more intentional about every aspect of this. And most of those things work just as well. We just have to use the tools. Planning and integration. You're hiring somebody new. Well, they're not going to meet everybody physically in the building. So you have to schedule times for them on Zoom calls to meet with people in an intentional way to get to know them, because they're not going to otherwise. So the biggest difference is it requires a level of intentionality that it didn't necessarily require before.
Almost that things that would happen by chance, now you actually have to plan and structure.
That's exactly it, Kristen. You have to plan those because they're not going to happen by chance because we're not together.
Absolutely. So another question that came in is there an ideal number of behaviors and fundamentals that makes the ritualization more effective and more sustainable?
Yes. And so this answer is going to surprise the audience. So I'll just warn you right now, because I deal with it in every Vistage group. So the first thing I would say is the right number is whatever you have. There is really no right number. But having done this, so this process that I described on this webinar, we have done in more than 500 organizations. So there's a lot of data about this. I will often ask people, what do you think the least number of behaviors I've ever seen is in those 500? And believe it or not, the least number I've ever seen is 18. It's the only one I've ever seen less than 20. The most I've ever seen is 40, which happens to be a Vistage company, and it's really successful. The sweet spot usually ends up somewhere in the 25 to 30 area. I would tell you that virtually every one of those organizations began the process saying, no way, that can't work. That's not going to work for me. None of those companies are saying that.
It seems like a lot.
It does seem like a lot. The conventional wisdom for why we should only have 3 or 4 or 5 is because people can't remember more than that. And you're right, they can't. But here's the question I always ask people. What's our goal? Is our goal to have something our people can recite? Or is our goal to have our people live the behaviors that drive success in our company? Obviously, it's the latter. And there's more than 5 behaviors that drive success. I happen to have 30 in my company, and I share them in every Vistage group. And I always ask people, so if you only want 5 of these, tell me which 25 of these you don't want to be teaching in your company. You would be giving up a lot of important things. The reason, by the way, that the number doesn't matter is whether you have 3 or 11 or 17 or 26, we're only going to focus on one at a time. And we're going to cycle through them over and over again forever. So it doesn't really matter. There is an outer limit. If there were 300 of them, we'd never get back to the beginning. But outside of something silly, it doesn't matter. And we're not going up to anybody saying, Christian, can you recite number 11? No, right. I don't need anybody to recite anything. I just know if we take one at a time and we focus on it intently and we cycle through them over and over and over again, sooner or later, they're going to become internalized in our people. That's why the number doesn't really matter.
Gotcha. Okay. And then another question is, how important is culture and purpose to millennials and Gen Z employees versus the earning of a compatible market salary?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, certainly there's been a lot written, and for good reason, about the younger generations and how culture means so much to them. But the way that question was phrased in comparison to a competitive market salary, that's an important note there, because no question, younger people are more attracted to culture than any other single thing. They will work somewhere that has a culture that they feel aligned to before working anywhere else, and they will stay in a company that has a culture that they feel connected to versus going somewhere else. That doesn't mean we don't have to pay them a competitive market salary. And so
we've got a great culture, but we don't pay very well.
Anything. They'll work for free, won't they? So we still have to be competitive, but culture is actually, when you look at all the surveys that look at why people stay or leave a company, money is always like number 8 on the list. Outside of something extreme, again, if I'm being paid way under market and somebody's going to give me $100,000 more, I don't care about the culture, somebody's going. But outside of the extremes, if somebody's going to get paid a little bit more or a little bit less, as long as we're reasonably competitive, culture's the trump card. Culture will keep people and attract people way more than any other single factor in every survey you look at, especially with the younger people, but even with older people. It matters to people more now than ever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, we've wrapped up our questions for today. So I'm going to thank you again so much for sharing your insights, David, with all of our Vistage members today.
It is totally my pleasure. I'll offer people one last thing that I'll offer to every Vistage member that I speak to in Vistage groups is that I have a video that I share with people that I know that one of the challenges people face in Vistage meetings is they hear all kinds of great ideas and they get all excited and then they go back to work and they don't know how to explain it to somebody else. And their teammates are rolling their eyes because they just came back from Vistage again. And I always tell people I can help them with that. And I have a video. It's a 12-minute video that is cleverly called my 12-minute video. It's a marketing thing. And it starts by saying your CEO or senior leader just came back from Vistage. They're all excited about something, but they don't know quite how to explain it. Let me explain it to you. In the next 11 minutes, I explain the entire concept. It's been a very useful tool for leadership teams that you could share it with your leadership team and in a condensed way that can get the entire concept. If anybody that's watching this webinar would like that video, shoot me an email. My email is there, david@culturewise.com, and I will send you a link to that video, which you'll find helpful.
Great. Thank you so much, David.
My
Appreciate
pleasure.
you being here. We'll be sending a link to today's recording and slides within 24 hours. We welcome you to join us for more of our upcoming webinars, including for our members. If you have not had the opportunity to listen to last week's session with the legendary leader of Ford and Boeing, Alan Mulally, that recording is available through October 9th on my Vistage. And next week, open to everyone, is Dr. Maureen Ori, who will be sharing 6 lessons for improving employee wellness and resilience. So thank you, everyone, for your time today. Be safe and be well.